Today's demonstration is silk dyeing. It is a beautiful craft. Like a lot of things at the moment, there are issues with the way silk is produced. To produce normal silk, the cocoon that is used to produce the silk is plunged into hot water while the creature is still inside, the moth is still inside it. I've always in the past tried to use piece silk. Now the difference between piece silk and normal silk is that the piece silk is they wait for the moth to emerge and then they use the cocoon afterwards. So the moth isn't injured, it isn't killed, but for a lot of people just the fact that it belongs to an animal makes it not really suitable. And that's fine, and I completely understand that. One of the difficulties in recent years is because there has been this upsurge in feelings about how silk is produced. Piece silk, which used to be incredibly cheap, is now incredibly expensive. And while I'm fine with that for the fact that it's a fairly cruelty-free alternative, of course it does mean that the craft that used to be very cheap is now quite expensive. But that's the way of life. This is silk in its basic standard. This is quite thin silk. It's not the greatest quality, but it is beautiful. It's very fine, it's very floaty. You can get silk in lots of different grades. I use a lot of this very thin silk because it does dye really well. As I say, it's not the very best quality because piece silk was always what it's called schlubby, so it's often got like little faults in it, which I don't mind. I quite like the faults, I must admit. So anyway, what you need is you need some plain silk that hasn't been dyed. You then wash it and what's known as mordant it. Now this just means that you wash it in something that allows the silk to open up, and it's to allow the way it's structured. It's a bit like hair, in that if you wash your hair with certain things it opens up and it takes dye, for example. It's exactly the same thing, same principle. So you wash it, and for silk you wash it in vinegar, white vinegar I use. You can use the very technical stuff and buy it in a powder, but it's still white vinegar basically, so I use white vinegar. And then to fix it I use a microwave, but that's probably another tutorial another day. So the things you'll need are some plastic tubs. Under no circumstances when you're dyeing should you ever use metal or wood. Metal will change the dye and wood will just absorb it, so it's another great chance to recycle. So I keep plastic tubs for this, and you also need a plastic jug, and again this is a recycled one I picked up in a charity shop. Charity shops are wonderful things. You also need a few jars, again great for recycling, because when you finished your jam or your beetroot or whatever, you wash it out. And you do need some of these because you do have to keep the dye in separate jars. Some cling film, not my favourite stuff, but you do need it unfortunately. I'm sure there are alternatives, and I have tried various things that they don't work quite as well as cling film, but I don't use much of it. It does last a very, very long time. Absolutely you need some plastic gloves. There really is now. It does stain very badly, so you need plastic gloves. And if you're using the kind of dyes I use, you do need a mask. I mean, these should be fairly common these days. I can't imagine there's anyone that doesn't have some. But they are powder, and I will explain some of the dyes and the issues with the dyes in a minute. But if you're using chemical dyes, you do need to use this because they are very powdery and they go everywhere, so that they can come up in a cloud of dust. So please be aware that you should wear something that you don't breathe it in. Now, many years ago I purchased some of these dyes. They are Procyon dyes, and they are chemical dyes from a place called Chemtex. I have a number of colours, and I'm going to open this very carefully because it's very light and very powdery. This has probably lasted me for the last 20 years, so, and I've still got that much left in. If I show the camera there, you can see it's very fine powder. You use about half a teaspoon, and that will probably make enough dye to dye everything you need and some left over. There are issues with the fact that it isn't particularly eco-friendly these days, and in all honesty, when that's finished, will I rebuy this? Probably not. I will look at some alternatives, but for the most part I try not to waste it, and I will explain in a minute what I do with my leftover rather than just swilling it down the sink. It's a little weird, but it does stop it just going down the sink. There will always be a certain amount that you have to wash away. There's not really any way around that. But it's essentially not that different to when you're washing your clothes, because you're washing the dye out of your clothes all the time. Every time you wash your clothes, the fabric sheds and dye comes out of it. So, is it perfect? No. Is it a great eco? No, not really. I'm just going to show you that. That is a cocoon. That is a little cocoon. That's how silk starts off, like that. Incredibly fine, incredibly beautiful. As I say, if you use piece silk, it just means that this has emerged. It's emerged from the hole, and they usually just slice it out just so they can fit it onto the machine that it fits on, and then it now spins it, because most of it isn't spun by people anymore, it's spun by machine. Right, so that's how it starts off, plain and white, and these are the kind of things that you can get from it. The colours are just incredible, and I have used natural dyes. I do a lot of natural dyeing, and I can honestly say there is no comparison. You cannot get this type of colour in a natural dye, or certainly not one that I can find. You can get bright colours, but they don't match the Procyon dyes, but they are more eco-friendly. So you get all sorts of that, and this is using a microwave to microwave and set the colour. Then it's washed out and dried, and I make a lot of bags and scarves, pretty much anything. I mean, I even use the scraps up and use them in scrapbooks or for the back of greetings cards, and then I put something on the front. Not one scrap of this is ever wasted. I use it for everything, and I even keep these little bits and I use them in my weaving, and I weave with them because they're so beautiful that then it shouldn't be wasted. So I never ever waste any of this at all. If I show you the kind of things that I make with them, these are a few bags, and I've been testing out some of these sort of frames. I'm not entirely sure I like the frames. I do quite like just the plain one. But this is the kind of colours that you can get just with some droppers and some dye. It is also one of my favourite crafts to do with children or with people with learning difficulties who have difficulty managing difficulty with dexterity. It's probably one of the easiest things to teach people. It is such a simple way of making something beautiful. This one I did silk, but then I machined across the top, and I've put different sort of things, so it's got different textures. So this is silk waste, that's what it's called, silk waste, that I dyed as well. Different types of silk waste, all stitched into a bag. Add a little bit of shiny in, all sorts of, it's an experiment, and I love that effect. Then of course you have just a very, I do like it kept very simple, because I do feel that the fabric is pretty enough by itself without lots of fancy bits on it. And obviously this is the handle that is Kumihimo'd, using a different type of silk, but it's really beautiful and the colours are incredible. Now over the past few years I've been experimenting with natural colours, with things out of the garden, and I've been doing some of this, and this is basically stuff out of my garden, and this is natural dyeing, and it's become my new passion and I do enjoy it. And this is just getting things like, I think that was a blackberry and different types of leaves, and then you add it in, roll it up, and this one you don't microwave, you steam it, but it comes out with that. And some are a little bit more delicate, but it's been an incredible way of working out what dyes, what colour. Some of them are absolutely amazing colours there. As you can see, the difference in colour is incredible, and it's not until you look at them in comparison you can see this is a very fake colour and this is a very natural colour. The silk is the same silk, it's just this is chemical and that is natural. And that's the one that the dog got at, which was nice until he, as a puppy, decided to drag it off the line and rip it and run it around the garden. I love dogs, you can see why. But you know what? This will still be used. It's still going to be used in things. It'll be used for some weaving, and I'll probably just cut it into small pieces and re-dye it. I love dogs. So that is silk dyeing. It's a much bigger and more complicated thing to explain, which I may go into at some point. But you can see why it's one of my favourites. I've also done some with a bit of beading. And a piece that I've just machined and beaded because it came out just so pretty that I just wanted to embellish it and work with the colours that are already there and produce this absolutely beautiful piece of fabric. So this also crosses over into making your own fabric, because you're just using a basic fabric with a bit of dye and you're starting to embellish. This is why I absolutely love silk dyeing. No other fabric takes colour the way this does. But as I said, it does have its wasteful side. So what I started to do was, when I'd finished dyeing and I had some left in the jar, because you've nearly always got some dregs left in the jar, I kept all the kitchen roll that I'd been using to wipe up after myself. I always use some kitchen roll or something, and just to wipe up and wipe spoons, because you use spoons to get the dye. So I started to use the kitchen roll and stuff it into the jar. At the end of the session, instead of throwing it away, I got all the kitchen roll that I'd been using and I stuffed it into the jars, so it soaked up all the leftover dye. And then I left it overnight, and I then put it out to dry in the sun, rather than try and, obviously if you try and wash it, it's paper, it will disintegrate. So I then stretched it out in the sun and I let it dry. Now obviously it's paper, so it's going to be quite delicate, so by the time it's dried it starts to fray a bit and it starts to fall apart. So I then put it on some scrap fabric and I stitched it, and that's what this book cover is. It's all the dyes that I've been using, and it's stitched onto some fabrics, and you can see the little breaks in it where it started to, and I love this effect. I think it is so beautiful. I absolutely adored it, and this became the most fun part of doing it. So that's the way I'm trying to make the dyes a little more eco-friendly, in that at least they're getting used, and that's not being swirled down the sink. There is still some residue. Obviously you have to wash the jars out afterwards, but there's a tiny bit left in compared to the amount you'd swirl down the sink. So that's my silk dyeing, and possibly one of my favourite crafts to do. I find it incredibly relaxing, and also one of my favourite crafts to teach. I really don't think there's anyone who couldn't learn how to do it. It is so simple and it has such pleasing results. So I hope you've enjoyed that. If you want to know more, let me know.